Over the course of the 1980s and the 1990s, you have the gradual resolution of Cold War conflicts, but also you have the implications of deep systemic violence and occasionally the recovery from genocidal circumstances that occurred as part of the so-called Cold War. Such is the case with the country of Guatemala. Nicole Rafter, who is an expert in the study of genocide and mass violence and has collaborated extensively with historians of various cases, raises the question, how do genocides end? Not just the Nazi genocide and the DK regime in Cambodia, which were both brought on by armed interventions in the end, especially in the case of Cambodia, where the Vietnamese military, the People's Army of Vietnam, invades Cambodia to end the genocide. But more broadly, how do they end? In this circumstance, morality is rarely part of the question. Now, we may all agree on the sort of moral circumstances of mass violence, but it's important for us to realize that those individuals who participated in mass violence, who encouraged it, often did so with the convictions that they were acting in a moral fashion to prevent even greater violence. So we must, in an analytical bent, perhaps somewhat ironically, subtract morality from the scenario. Rafter posits several ends based on historical cases. In the first case, you have Suharto's achievement scenario, where, backed by the United States, Suharto argued that the PKI had been eliminated. In other words, the genocide was successful in this case. Now, this is not the total eradication of Chinese in Indonesia, which many might think, but the total eradication of the PKI. And there is a genocidal dimension to this, wherein people who are Chinese are presumed to be members of the PKI. But once the PKI is presumed eliminated, that's an achievement, within quotes, for the Suharto regime. It's a successful purge, so to speak. This is also called attrition in some cases, or just wearing out, where disease and starvation are common. Now, that's not the case in Indonesia, but in other cases. So you have this sort of dissolvement and aging out, which is really sort of a separate phenomenon, where the members who are committing the genocide in, for example, Sudan, just sort of aged out. They were too old, or there's a dissolvement of the regime gradually. Then, in a third scenario, there's a flee and resist scenario. So you have the Rwanda Patriotic Front and Tutsi Ugandan-based resistance, which has fled Rwanda and then resists during the course of the Rwandan genocide and the end of that. And then there's outside intervention, right, which is the fourth case, which is Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. That's the People's Army of Vietnam directly invades Cambodia. So, a question for one discussion post, if you choose to select this, might be, why are these typologies useful? Throughout this series of slides, I will pose several other discussion questions. For your discussion post, simply pick a question and answer it, but do try and keep the threads together. So if you see somebody who's already answered the question you're going to answer, reply directly to them and then move on. Most of the data from the case of the Guatemalan genocide was gathered from the Catholic Archdiocese Report of Guatemala and examined the crimes against the ethnic Mayan population of Guatemala from 1981 to 1983. Now, it's important to remember that the Reagan administration staunchly backed the Guatemalan military governments in the name of anti-communism during this period, so the acts that are being committed are very similar to those in Indonesia. It's genocide with the excuse of anti-communism. There was, however, an earlier systemic violence against the Mayan population. So you could go all the way back to the conquistadors first for the first wave of systemic violence. We're talking 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, right? And then there's a second wave of systemic violence against Mayans, ethnic Mayans, during the independence period in the 19th century. Then, in the 20th century, the short-lived democratic, small d democratic Guzman government might have changed the dynamics. However, after 1954, the government was overthrown in part with American backing of the Guatemalan military, and this led to a 36-year-long civil war that resulted in 200,000 dead or disappeared. So Guatemalan politics is already unstable thanks to Washington intervening directly in Guatemalan politics and backing the military overthrow of a democratically elected government in the name of anti-communism. So that's the Civil War period. Then you have a rotating series of military leaders who rise up through the ranks of the Guatemalan elite. This includes the Garcia regime and the Enrios Montt regime, which ruled Guatemala as a brutal dictatorship from 1979 to 1982 and also 1982 to 1983. They explicitly targeted Maya guerrilla identity, who were fighting for their own liberation. They argued that this was a unified communist threat, fed information to the American intelligence service of the CIA, and this information was fed to Washington. They also imposed language restrictions, forced conscription, and targeted Maya villages for raids massacring civilians, especially young men. In the end, there was a first wave of violence in which 100,000 to 150,000 Maya were killed. 150,000 fled to Mexico, whereupon later many of those individuals would become refugees again or immigrants again to the United States. There was also up to 10 times this number, so 1.5 million internal displacements and refugees within the country as well. So there's an incredibly unstable circumstance within the country which could create the potential wherein later systemic violence or societal unrest would create massive refugee movements fleeing the country. Now, in the case of the Guatemalan genocide, there is broad recognition that it ends when Enrios Montt is ousted in August of 1983. However, systemic violence continues. Additionally, a Chinese Mayan journalist named Myrna Mack begins to investigate the systemic violence and also investigate links to American governments and the CIA in the backing of these particular waves of violence. Then, Myrna Mack is murdered. She's pictured here in an undated photograph that was circulated by the San Francisco Union Tribune in 2014. Her murder occurred on September 11th of 1990 by a CIA-backed death squad, as Mack had revealed the military's crimes. Military violence and civil war nonetheless continued in Guatemala throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. It continued until 1996, ending approximately the same time as the Cambodian Civil War ended. Genocidal elements of the military and associated militias essentially went below the radar from the 1980s through the 1990s, following a pattern that occurred in Indonesia. Notable in the Guatemala case is that the UNRG, the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary militia that was pro-Maya, were allowed to enter government as a political party as per the agreement of a peace treaty in the course of the 1990s. Now, I've not published about this yet, but I essentially would call this process parliamentary pacification. What it means is parliamentary end to civil conflicts when multiple parties involved in those civil conflicts agree to lay down their arms and enter parliament as political parties. It is essentially what Sukarno attempted to do in Indonesia but failed to do. This occurred very briefly in Guatemala. However, there was a certain problem in that the right-wing death squads were never held accountable for their crimes against civilians. This created a problem where they remained essentially in power. Evidence, nonetheless, was gathered by the Archdiocese and the Catholic Church. It was presented in 1998. It was presented in 2003 to the broader public. But the question remains, what were the results? In the case of the Guatemalan genocide, Rios Montt was tried, convicted, and exonerated. The militias, however, had no formal consequences, and neither did most of the military leaders involved in the genocide. There were also other outcomes: economic havoc, homelessness and starvation, physical wounds and broken health, care systems, psychological traumas that lasted for decades, constant anxiety and fear, loss of personal and community identity, orphans, refugees, paralyzing sorrow, cultural destruction, and ecological degradation were all consequences highlighted by the Archdiocese report and others. Furthermore, post-war violence continued. As of 2013, the murder rate was 34 in 100,000. 6 in 100,000 is the global average in that particular year. Death squads and militias became active mercenaries for cartels because they needed jobs over the course of the 1980s and the 1990s, and initially the cartels had been given a green light by American anti-communists. Cartels replaced the government in some areas, targeting hire of soon-to-be ex-militiamen. Indeed, the cartels were attempted to be cracked down upon by the Reagan administration to a certain extent in a disastrous fashion. What the Reagan administration essentially did was increase their profit margins by cracking down on them. Extortion, kidnapping, and automobile theft, raids, and so forth became even more prominent. The Reagan administration and the Bush administration's foreign policy in Guatemala was disastrous. Civilian militias became popular as a counter to cartels in Guatemala. Militarization had, however, so strongly influenced the value systems of the broader public and the behavior patterns of the broader public, it enabled the perpetrators to acquire expertise in just becoming violent, and therefore their expertise in being violent allowed them to perpetuate their power networks more broadly in the Guatemalan government, to expound upon the assessment of the Archdiocese report. Not only was the Republican foreign policy of the Bush administration and the Reagan administration disastrous in that it continued to back the militarization of Guatemala, but it was also directly behind the creation of a massive movement of refugees that fled Guatemala, beginning to move to Mexico or further southward toward Panama. So for another prompt to this post, and one which I would think is much more important than the first question, although the first question is a good way to get your brain moving. Consider the reading of Rafter. Rafter considers that there are those cases that peter out, and those cases that come to a definable halt. What is the case of Guatemala? What is the narrative? Who are the key actors and the key points in the genocide? When does it end? Does it ever end in the case of Guatemala? Why or why not? Go ahead and take 4 minutes to sort of prep to yourself before you post to collect your thoughts. Make a quick point or a couple of points, and let's get the discussion going.